property is space. It's land. But property is really just a social construction. And as a social construction, it's modified by the economy, it's modified by political concerns, it's modified by the need to provide shelter and food for human beings. But land itself doesn't belong to really anyone. If it belongs to anyone, it belongs to all of the creatures throughout the year, throughout the seasons, who use this land for their shelter and their sustenance, whether it's a burrow in the ground or whether it's a nest up in the trees, whether it's the seeds that fall on the ground or the fruit that comes through the production of berries. The land is productive, and the earth that we live on produces a tremendous amount of surplus, because if it didn't produce surplus, it would not be successful at regeneration. And in that way, we begin to understand the land. Geographers say that, there's a space, that things, what we live in, what we're surrounded by is space, and it's only when we begin to put labels on it, when we begin to define its uses and its values to us, that it becomes place. And it's that subjectivity that exists everywhere. But specifically, the objectivity of land is when we put definition to it. And once we begin to put definition to it, then it can become property. This lecture is based upon 4 principles of analysis. The first is the basics of Indigenous theory. Indigenous theory is different from Western methodologies in that it looks to understand the diversity of things rather than seeking a universal truth, as Western methodology does. The second component is how Indigenous property use develops as a cultural pattern. So we want to look at how Indigenous peoples in various places have developed an idea of property or land division in some form that allows them a social and economic advantage. And thirdly, we want to look at some comparisons to colonial ideological understandings of property, because in studying the comparisons, both systems really do take on more of their own characteristics. We also want to look at how Indigenous property understandings are important to Indigenous resurgence. We talked a lot in this part of the 21st century about Indigenous people relieving themselves of colonialism and developing or redeveloping their ability as cultures. And so we want to look at how Indigenous property understandings can lead to this, and actually may help us all as a society, as a larger society, in tackling some of the problems that besiege us today. So let's start with some definitions. First of all, let's look at the word Indigenous. I like to use this definition: a quality of community life, having adapted a knowledgeable culture in a specific place where human and ecosystem activities support and enhance one another. This definition sums up a number of facets that are really important in Indigenous life. First of all, community. Indigeneity, at least the skills of Indigenous life, can be learned by anyone. But the skills have to be practiced as a group and have to be integrated into economy, into the social networks, into trade, and into the way in which people get along and organize themselves. So another factor is a knowledgeable culture, in that this is not just about learning specific tools. This is about a whole complex of knowledge that informs people. For instance, I'll give you an example. Among the Algonquins of the Ottawa River, they used 240 different plants for food. That meant that throughout the entire year, whether it was winter or summer, they had access to particular plants that could be either dug or harvested out of the lake that could be used. And this is plant foods, and used for food. A number of other plants also served as medicine. So that's a strong, complex knowledge system that supports that community. Also in a specific place. A place that is known, that the knowledge system incorporates the boundaries and also the internal products and resources of that place so that people's lives can be better. So a specific place that can be known intimately. And it's a place where their human behavior within that ecosystem enhances both themselves and the environment itself, so that the environment can continue to replicate itself. So, a quality of community life, having adapted knowledgeable culture in a specific place where human and ecosystem activities support and enhance one another. That's indigeneity. Now that's different than Aboriginal. Aboriginal is a word under the Canadian Constitution specifically that defines a relationship between people of Indigenous heritage and the nation state. So we're not really talking about Aboriginal right here. We're talking about Indigenous property ideas and understandings. Well, Indigenous goes back a long way as well. It has its roots in Latin. The root word of indigenous is gignere, which has Latin roots, but it also has roots in the Eastern Mediterranean world. It's essential in the Arabic understanding of cosmology and was later incorporated into Islamic understandings of spirit beings as the jinn or the genie. This Arabic understanding correlates very well with the Anishinaabeg understandings of essential spirits, whereas each creature had an essential spirit. For instance, there was a spirit of the rabbit, a spirit of the fox, and a spirit of human beings. Now, that is a reference to the individual spirit of each species. It's not the only word that's ever been used. For instance, the word autochthonous has been used by the early Greeks. Ancient Athenians considered their ancestors the primordial inhabitants of their land, and as though they sprang from the very soil of the region itself. Their word was used, autochthonous, was used for any true-born Athenian. Autochthon itself springs from auto, meaning self, and chthon, meaning the earth. Indigenous cultures emerge as human knowledge systems based on a relational experience with distinct ecosystems. In the slide that you're looking at right now, you'll see this sentential calculus, CS1 equals PS/D plus F RC plus RA parentheses drift. Now what this basically means is that cultural systems equal place, that is security and defense, plus food systems that rely upon these replenishment cycles, and that RA stands for rational adaptation, because all cultures are changing over time. There's a thing called cultural drift. When all of these things work together, then an indigenous society has a much better possibility of survival and continuance. Indigenous cultures are epistemologically driven. That is, they are determined and reinforced by knowledge acquired through an interaction with complex energetic environments. And indigenous knowledge systems are complex relations and reflections of empirical local experience, rational discovery, symbolic imagery, and social reinforcement. The map that's on this slide was used by Olive Dickinson to show the various cultural languages, ethnic languages that were here in North America before European contact. What's really important about this map is it not only distinguishes where those root languages were and the many dialects that they included, but it also shows distinct environmental systems, particularly watersheds that are existent still in North America today. And that tells us that the experience of indigenous people really was dependent upon the ecosystem. So the language, that which expressed their realities, grew up and emerged and developed within particular ecosystems, or at least contingent environments. That's important because it reminds us that indigenous cultures emerge out of the earth itself. One of the things that we know that's quite obvious when we begin to study indigenous people is that, contrary to the myth that indigenous people wander around aimlessly chasing game and scrounging for food, they actually follow predictable patterns of travel. Whether they're seasonal migratory or they're sending out hunting parties from village sites, their migratory patterns are consistent over long periods of time. They also settle into defined spaces, those ecosystems that I was just talking about, because their knowledge systems are dependent upon a relationship with the environment. And they develop technologies that are dependent on permanency and predictability. So their technologies are responsive to their technological development, are responsible to the qualities of life that they're encountering on a day-to-day basis. Indigenous economies are often referred to as domestic modes of production. And that's because the essential unit of production is the family itself, the domestic unit. And that could range from a small nuclear group, father, mother, maybe some older children and some younger children, and maybe some aunts and uncles, or it could be a much more extended family of grandparents, numerous aunts and uncles, and parents of children. So in that respect, that's the domestic mode of our unit of production. Here's an interesting slide. It's a simple formula. It represents indigenous economies. There's two equations that are really important here. And why I'm talking about this is because in indigenous understandings of land and eventually the development of their ideas around property really emerge from these formulas and from the economic activities that they engage in. So the first is this: never consume more matter or energy than can be restored through the replenishment cycles in a particular ecosystem. Now, the reason for that is you don't want to overexploit your ecosystem, that which you know and understand the best. You don't want to overexploit that because then it will no longer be productive enough to support you. Now, the next part of this equation is this: never expend more energy than what can be replaced by what you consume. Because if you expend more energy trying to track down the deer that you've just hunted and wounded, and it takes you more energy to finally subdue that animal, then you're not going to get the payback. You're not going to get the replenishment value of energy from the amount that you've already expended. So that's an important factor. Keep that in mind, because whether it's agriculture or whether it is hunting for indigenous people or herding, that has a big significance. It's not like taking oil out of the ground in one place in the world and using it to fuel machines that drive and create energy so that they can reproduce more. That's a totally different system altogether. This is a human energy system based on food consumption. So that's important for us to recognize in terms of a relationship with land and eventually with property. So both of these conditions are mitigated by cultural knowledge, expressed through art and poetry and songs, all those things like dance and story and spirituality, and also technology. So technologies have to be developed that stay consistent within this particular set of equations. So ecology is the baseline for understanding how indigenous cultures develop, migrate, and become complex organizations of human population. Let's begin to look at indigenous land use with two examples. First of all, seasonal migratory patterns existed among the Cree and the Algonquin in Ontario, and actually among many, many people around the world. In fact, up until about 2,000 years ago, much of northwestern Europe operated in this similar fashion. The map in front of you shows an area that's designated with some green lines and some blue lines and some brown lines. The brown lines that are dashed represent the height of land. On one side, in the brown territory, are a group of cultural group, and on the other side, which is green lines, would be a somewhat distinctive other cultural group. Now, the green lines are on this map show us two distinct hunting territories. The blue line running up through the middle with the large blue area, that's a lake, and on either side of that are two areas that would be divided between two domestic modes of production units. And so within those territories are also thinner blue lines that are areas that would be used on an annual basis. So one area would be used one year, and then the family would move to another area the following year another area, and this way they would allow for their larger territory to continue to regenerate the produce that it had to offer. Families would practice reciprocity. At the rapids, which are clearly indicated on one hunting territory, families would actually come together from a variety of hunting territories because those rapids provided a fish spawning area. They could provide a really good fishing area in the spring so that the harvest would be shared on that area, which was located in a particular family hunting territory. But people from other family hunting territories would come and share that. As well as that small little blue area just below the lake, that's a cranberry bog. And because not everybody had a cranberry bog, all the families were welcome to come and harvest the cranberries together. The lake might hold wild rice, for instance. Families from a number of territories would coalesce around the lake during the early fall for the rice harvest and share in that rice harvest, because the need for labor intensity was stronger then than it would be in the depth of winter when much of the area would be covered by snow. Reciprocity was practiced. Also, overlapping range of 2 or more indigenous groups. Overlapping uses could be shared, but primarily the focus for preserving and developing a replenishment cycles. The replenishment cycles was the business of a particular unit of that domestic mode of production. If the height of land serves as a natural boundary for many indigenous cultures or ethnicities, marrying across a boundary was a way of softening those boundaries so that if you needed to travel in someone else's territory, you could do so and say, do you know so-and-so? So-and-so is my cousin. So-and-so is my brother's wife. And that way you would be recognized as being a relative, even though maybe distant. And that would secure some safety and actually sharing at times when there was times of need. The process would be reversed in the springtime when hunting had come to an end, perhaps some fishing in this part of the world, maple sugaring, and then people would travel downstream and meet again in the summertime in collective gatherings where things like division of land, dependency on one another, where families that were large might share some of their labor with a family that needed more labor. When they traveled upriver in the fall again, there would be marriages and the renewal of old relationships. And that's how this type of land tenure, really based upon land use and land understanding in those knowledgeable cultures, would be cultivated. Now, I want to give you another example that takes place below or south of the St. Lawrence River among the Mohawk people, who were agriculturalists for the most part. Clearly, the Mohawk Valley is a very advantageous land. Mohawks enjoyed both a fertile agricultural land, a bottomland, and a position of middlemen on a major trade route from Lake Ontario to the Atlantic. Before contact, Mohawks enjoyed a sedentary village life. They hunted judiciously in the mountain regions on either side of the valley, and they enjoyed trade with those who passed up and down the river, bringing goods from the middle of the continent all the way out into the Atlantic world. For the Mohawks, populations were denser because there was a surplus of a agricultural society. Rather than seasonal migratory hunting societies, harvesting societies, they had to use self-defense, and they maintained that through building palisades around their villages. For instance, when their northern tribes became needy, they might come down and demand or raid the Mohawks for their agricultural goods, which were easily stored, much more easily stored over the winter time. And so the palisades were important for self-defense. They also developed a kind of diplomacy among similar-speaking Iroquoian-speaking peoples. So they developed the five Iroquois nations. They established the Great Peace, which bonded them all together as allies, and as a form of governance and diplomacy and trade and mutual protection. It was a different society in many ways. The fact that they didn't migrate from place to place because they were dependent upon maintaining their agricultural lands and having easy access to them. But it also created a different sort of system where they were much more aggregated together in villages that were not necessarily seasonal, but more permanent. Two very different sorts of indigenous qualities of life, and so they saw their lands in different ways, and they placed value or place value on their lands in different ways, but still within a domestic mode of production. When we begin to look at how land is divided up and ideas of property begin to develop, what we see is that population densities have a lot to do with the way in which economies differentiate values for land. For instance, with domestic modes of production among foragers, hunters, gatherers, and slash and burn agriculturalists or sedentary village life, what we see is a production of minimal surplus. So it's the use of land that's more important in the value system. It also means that the use is based on place-based knowledge. And again, the family is the production unit. Interestingly enough, the ideas around spirituality dominate in that all things seem to have an animacy or a spirit within them and are respected for their living value. When we begin to develop surplus modes of production through much denser populations like congregations of villages, we develop a big man social order. That is a chieftainship or a regional leader. And that establishes a gratuitous economy where the leader is responsible for determining who gets the surplus, who gets more than others in order to establish the kind of protection or the defense that the leader might need. And this creates class stratification as well. And in this system, we move away from the ideas of spirituality to the things of law and order and a religion where a singular or a multiple set of gods determine the distribution of things as well as the power that's vested in the chieftain or the leader. And in terms of property definition, we're beginning to develop an idea of dominion. The chieftain or the leader is the one who makes decisions around division of property and the use of property, rather than the individual modes of production. In modern times, we've developed energy-based modes of production where we create an unlimited surplus, where there's more than anyone can actually use. Also, these energy modes of production, modern industrial societies, they manage scarcity to stimulate production, for the population to become dependent upon that particular product or a set of products in order to maintain a stable or ascending economy. And there are multiple levels of unequal wealth distribution within these societies based upon the skill levels, but also based upon rank and station within the society itself.
And this is based often on ideological governance. Those who subscribe to the current ideology of the collective will be the ones who benefit, and those who are able to manage that ideological governance will benefit more. And that's where we begin to develop the ideas around private property, because those who benefit most have a greater access to private property. Western ideology is rooted in theocratic rationalism and economic class, which postulates that humans began in a primitive state and technological advancement will raise them to civilization. So the idea begins with the hunter-gatherer who sort of works hard for what they have, scrounges for a living, and then the animals that they're hunting, they decide that they're going to domesticate, and they'll herd around to the various places where they can find sustenance. And then someone else decides that those things that are providing sustenance for the animals can all actually be raised in a particular place much better, and so they begin to aggregate in agriculturally viable places. And finally, to move the agricultural products and the artistic products that are created and the technological products that are created by the surplus that agriculture produced, and also the spare time that apparently agriculturalists have, then they have to be moved around by mercantilists, who are the traders and the investors who can capitalize on all of this great surplus. And that is the ultimate level of society. It's at that level that private property becomes not only individualized but also corporatized in a capitalist system. In reality, this system is simply not a rise toward real civilization. What it represents is a euphemistic understanding of another system that's created out of, with the higher population, a higher amount of surplus labor and control by the elites. And that's based upon a system where there's the poor, the workers, the managers, and the wealthy. And so the ideas that Farb talked about in his theory were based on an ideological truth that existed within the current economic system, which supports the concept of human progress. Progress has become the predominant excuse for capitalism and colonialism, and has begun to define in many ways, or I should say redefine in many ways, what indigenous life was like and what it meant in terms of the way in which land was separated, designated, and created into property. Today we have a system where industrial states, which are dependent upon colonialism and indigeneity, have really intersected in a large way. Still today, there's something like 6,000 indigenous societies around the world. However, the majority of populations are dominated by industrial states. And this intersection is a interwoven process between the two. For instance, colonial societies, capitalist societies exist because they are dependent upon the exploitation of tertiary resources, non-renewable resources for the most part, and the labor of a wholly dependent class of people without property. And on the other side, we have indigenous societies that exist because they are dependent on themselves and the replenishment cycles within distinct local ecosystems where they live and exist. And this creates almost a perpetual conflict over the ideals of property and property use and ownership. And we can find some of the beginnings of this really in the 17th century with the rise of the modern nation state in Europe. And it's synonymous with the evolution of colonial capitalism, state dominion over all property, and private ownership as we know it today. John Locke was the author and a contributor to this ideology. He said that, when the most powerful would work together in a kind of contractual diplomacy so that all men who were willing to labor, lead moral lives, and submit to the rule of law would prosper. Now, if you want to take this apart a little bit, it was labor, meaning those who were deserving because they worked for what they had. Those who were indigent, who couldn't work or were unable to work or unwilling to work, were not deserving. And they also needed to live moral lives because he based his ideas upon a moral code that was very much part of the religion of the time. And taking the religion and turning it into a civil code was a way of ensuring that there was a mutual recognition of each other who were able to labor and lead moral lives, and also submit to the rule of law. Now, this is particularly interesting because up until this time, remember, the chieftain or what had become the king laid claim to a kind of dominion over all of the land. Well, Locke said, we've got to recognize that because that creates some stability. But within that dominion, we need to begin to divide land up into private holdings where people can use that land and not waste it. So Locke also dismissed indigenous life because he lived in a time when North America and other places in the world were beginning to be discovered and colonized by European states. And he dismissed indigenous life as inferior. He saw that indigenous people were vulnerable to the power manifested in technology and militarism, slavery, and capitalism. And he saw that indigenous people had a right to what they might hunt within a raw land, but because the land was natural, their possession of things was no more than that of the deer or the bear or the squirrel who could find their sustenance on the ground. That they owned nothing more and could not understand the idea of property. They couldn't own property because they had not risen to a level of civilization where it meant anything. However, what John Locke failed to realize was that indigenous people understood the system in a totally different way. So he said every man has the right to life, liberty, and property. That sounds like a pretty nice thing. So let's take a look at it. The right to live in peace without submission or threats by arbitrary authority. The rights of people to live well without being harassed or subjugated in some way. The rights of the individual is very much encoded in this type of language. Liberty, the right to decide one's own fate within a fair social contract, unmolested by aristocracy or ruled by unjust laws. And so again, he's talking about a rights discourse in which the individual is recognized as paramount to the collective in many ways. And then he talked about property, the right to claim and hold property when it has been labored for. So those who are capable of laboring, either with their capital or with their physical ability, or with their ability to manipulate the world around them. One encloses it. And enclosure took on many aspects. It meant building fences, it meant building walls, it meant subscribing by a title, a paper title, what the metes and bounds of a particular property were. And he said for the greater individual profit, so that the bourgeoisie could continue to amass capital and fortune in order to promote civilization, and also to profit the community of man. Very altruistic point of view. The poor cannot do that. The working class can only do that through the contributions of their day labor, and the wages that they might earn were a recompense for that amount of labor. And again, they were not able to really deliver to the community of man. Only the wealthy, only the more powerful were able to modify and change and develop societies in a way that would benefit all human beings, which again established a kind of bourgeoisie aristocracy. So indigenous cultures are vulnerable to imperial and colonial economies. And so this map, which is very similar to the one that I showed you before, except that the designations of states and provinces are divided into geometrical forms. Colonial governance structures, they conform little to environmental conditions or to ecosystem realities. For the most part, political boundaries are created to serve a system of colonial settlement, resource extraction, industrial manufacture, while denaturing the ecosystems and limiting environmental appropriate governance. So by dividing up land in squares and rectangles or geometric figures, all the way down to private property that is owned by individuals or corporations, we see a denaturing of the indigenous economies. So the working class as well is subverted by this system. Private property is subclass state or provincial jurisdiction and a means for production control and taxation. All private property is subject to governance planning policy, potential expropriation, and arbitrary seizure of tax default. So still the rule of law, or the king's law, is still in force and effect, but now it's governed by a ruling elite of the bourgeoisie. So now let's look at how indigenous property understandings are important to indigenous resurgence. Present government policies create a lot of problems for the way in which indigenous peoples' ideas of land are reinforced. It means that government policies, because they're so different, impose restrictions upon the emergence of indigenous culture within their traditional territories. Let's look at current government policy. The idea is to get more and more indigenous people to take on Aboriginal identities and move toward urbanization and wage labor. In this way, we have a problem that happens where people bring their indigenous value systems into a more capitalist system, and that can create a lot of problems. For instance, when people find themselves in the urban poverty, they often resort to a more domestic mode of production. So what we get are Aboriginal youth gangs that are able to forage on the resources and surplus of the urban industrial society. The reserve system in itself was a way of, is considered right now by government policy to be a backward step. And of course it was. Because it placed people in concentration camps, which stagnated their cultural development because it alienated themselves from the use of their traditional lands. And so by converting concentration camps into suburban municipalities, what we're actually experiencing is creating rural poverty. There's also the idea that the government can offer or create a level of self-government for Aboriginal people. But by doing so, it creates a kind of federal municipality at a level of decision-making at a sub-provincial level without the constitutional recognition that, for instance, municipalities have through their designation or designated affiliation with provincial governments. Very confusing within the present constitutional matrix that we live in Canada today. It puts Aboriginal people and their forms of self-governance in a kind of limbo that's determined by a federal state, but does not have a real understanding of how to process their tenure to land. There's a level of tokenism. Haida case is a really good example of that promises, the federal court decision promises that Indigenous people in Canada will have a right to consultation and accommodation when they have a claim to original jurisdiction upon particular land. It's a kind of tokenism without the right to say no. In fact, the federal court said you don't have the right to say no, you don't have a veto, you only have a right to be consulted. And that you have to agree with, in the end, federal and provincial law and policy when it comes to the designation, use, and division of your traditional territories. As a place marker, as an identity within Confederation, this leaves people of Indigenous heritage in absolute limbo. Let's look at how Indigenous property understandings are important to all of us. Let's begin to contextualize the future a bit around this sort of middle ground that we find ourselves in. While individual Indigenous cultures emerge from distinct ecosystems, we all share a common planetary system. As the most powerful economic and political systems respond to climate change and experience peak resource exploration, rapid configuration of social and cultural contexts will occur. How they occur and what they carry forward into the future is fairly important. Can we continue to divide land on an incremental basis in order to satisfy a growing population? Or will we have to reconfigure the way we use property or think even about property so that more people can benefit and less people can suffer? What we need to look at are systems that were actually successful. Not just systems that were successful in the past, but there are many systems that are still successful today that are practiced by Indigenous people. It's not so much as learning or relearning an Indigenous language, it's learning the patterns of economy that fit best and stabilized Indigenous societies over long periods of time, allowing them to biologically produce the humans who we are today. The way forward, not necessarily the way back, but the way forward is to understand our relationship with the earth, not in terms of private, individual identity, politics, and ownership, but in a collective response to living better with what the earth is able to provide.